6. Escalation instability, when pressure awakens instinct. Escalation is often pictured as a simple, mechanical process, a structured chain of reporting, a logical ladder of authority. On an organizational chart, escalation looks clean. One box leads to another. Responsibility flows in tidy lines. But the lived reality in global organizations could not be more different. Escalation is not a technical mechanism. Escalation is an emotional act. And in multicultural environments, it becomes one of the most fragile, unpredictable behaviors a leader must navigate. Leaders frequently assume that escalation reflects the seriousness of an issue. But in practice, escalation reflects the emotional logic of the person confronting the issue. Two individuals can encounter the same problem and respond differently not because of competence, but because escalation carries different emotional meanings in their cultural and professional identities. For one, escalating early may feel responsible and transparent. For another, it may feel shameful or premature. For one, escalation is a sign of partnership. For another, it is a sign of failure. The moment pressure enters the system, these emotional meanings multiply. A senior supply chain vice president once recounted a crisis in which a critical defect appeared in a product used across multiple regions. His instruction was clear: if anything looks off, escalate immediately. The problem was that immediately meant something different in every region. One site escalated within minutes. Another waited for their supervisor's input. Another performed a series of internal checks before notifying anyone. Another escalated sideways to colleagues, not upward, believing that involving leadership would signal incompetence. None of these teams misunderstood his instruction. They simply interpreted the emotional implications of escalation differently. In some cultures, escalation is a natural extension of teamwork, an invitation to solve a problem collectively. In others, escalation disrupts hierarchy and risks causing embarrassment. A team member in such an environment once told me, "We cannot escalate until we are certain, because escalating too early implies we do not know what we're doing." Meanwhile, a colleague in another region described escalating early as a sign of loyalty. "If I wait too long, it looks like I hid the issue." These assumptions do not arise consciously. They are embedded in years of cultural conditioning, organizational experience, and the emotional climate established by previous leaders. Escalation is a deeply felt behavior, not a procedural one. And that is why it becomes unstable when pressure rises. During calm periods, escalation tendencies may sit quietly beneath the surface. But under pressure, instinct takes over. Pressure accelerates emotional reflexes. It makes people rely on the behaviors that once kept them safe, whether that safety came from hierarchy, speed, caution, or consensus. The organization suddenly stops behaving as a unified entity and begins behaving as a collection of emotional reflexes, all triggered by the same event but expressed in very different ways. One engineering leader described how his team fractured during a safety incident. His European team escalated quickly, believing the incident demanded immediate visibility. His East Asian team waited, gathering certainty before escalating. His American team escalated twice, once to leadership, once to the customer, assuming proactivity was the safest option. Each team felt their behavior was the correct response. But their instincts were shaped by different emotional rules. The result was chaos. Leadership received incomplete information, duplicated alerts, conflicting severity estimates, and contradictory timelines. The leader later said, "It felt like the problem was multiplying as it traveled." In reality, the problem wasn't multiplying, the interpretations were. Escalation had become unstable, not because people failed to follow procedure, but because pressure had activated their cultural instincts. The silence around escalation is equally significant. Silence is not often recognized as a form of escalation behavior, yet it may be the most telling. In many cultures, silence under pressure signifies uncertainty or caution. People wait for permission, context, or emotional cues before acting. In other cultures, silence is a sign that the issue is being handled, that escalation is unnecessary. Leaders often misinterpret silence as stability, when it may actually signal hesitation or fear. A global HR director once told me she had believed all regions were coping well during a restructuring because her weekly calls were quiet. Only later, through confidential conversations, did she learn that some teams were overwhelmed but felt that escalating their concerns would be inappropriate. Silence felt like respect. To her, it looked like alignment. Escalation instability often hides inside silence long before it shows up in decisions. What makes escalation particularly delicate is that it is relational. Escalation is not just about the issue, it is about the relationship with authority. It requires people to judge whether the leader wants to be involved, whether the timing is appropriate, whether the escalation will be seen as helpful or disruptive, whether it will affect their reputation, and whether it will change the emotional climate of the interaction. The act of escalation is therefore never neutral. It is always loaded with questions the leader cannot see. This is why escalation drift can quietly reshape the entire speed and direction of an organization. When one region escalates aggressively, leadership becomes flooded with noise, making it difficult to distinguish genuine threats from cultural caution. When another region delays escalation, leadership becomes blind to rising risks. And when escalation patterns diverge across borders, the organization begins to experience two dangerous realities at once: too much information and too little, too early and too late. One of the biggest surprises for leaders is realizing that escalation instability does not necessarily reflect the severity of an issue, it reflects the emotional temperature of the organization. In high-trust environments, escalation tends to be timely. In environments shaped by fear, ambiguity, or past negative experiences, escalation slows or becomes filtered through layers of internal approval. Leaders often mistakenly attribute late escalation to incompetence when it is often a sign of emotional self-protection. Escalation patterns also reveal the internal narrative teams hold about their leaders. A team that escalates rapidly may believe their leader values transparency and quick action. A team that hesitates may believe their leader values harmony or certainty. These interpretations do not fall from the sky, they are created by the leader's tone, reactions, and emotional presence over time. Even one moment of frustration or one instance of dismissing an early alert can reshape how a team interprets the emotional risk of escalation for months. What emerges from all of this is a simple truth: escalation is not a reporting pathway, it is a cultural landscape. And unless leaders intentionally shape that landscape, interpretation fills the void. When leaders do not define what escalation means emotionally, each region defines it for themselves. Escalation becomes predictable only when leaders understand what it represents to the people delivering it: responsibility, danger, partnership, fear, respect, visibility, or risk. To create stability, leaders must recognize these emotional currents and begin designing the conditions in which escalation feels safe and uniformly meaningful. In the next chapter, we explore the deeper forces beneath these behaviors, the emotional logic that determines not just how people escalate, but how they interpret leadership itself.